welcome to Over Poetry Podcast.
I'm Micah.
And I'm Thew.
Here to enjoy 2 public domain poems live in front of your very eyes, or in this case, ears.
Mm-hmm.
And today we're going to be focusing on Alexander Pope.
Woo! Alexander Pope, everybody's favorite poet.
Except Edmund Curl, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, this is going to be an interesting one. We usually have Micah do a bio for us, but I also happen to know a lot about Alexander Pope. My thesis I wrote for grad school was inspired by his poetics in a number of ways, so...
It's going to be more of a back and forth today.
Yeah. Okay. But yeah, I mean, I'll throw it over to you, though, to just
get started.
Yeah.
Okay, and then you can interject and we can do it back and forth.
Perfect.
So, starting from the very beginning, Alexander Pope is born in 1688 in England, and he was born to a relatively wealthy merchant father, but there's a problem. They're Catholic.
No!
Ah! So, with a lot of different political machinations that are happening at the time, his father's actually forced to move out of London because there was actually a law, like when the monarchy changed, after a Jacobite-like rebellion and a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment got stirred up. There was actually a law that Catholics couldn't live within 10 miles of London, and also they weren't allowed to attend university.
Whoa.
Or really hold public office. So Alexander Pope's life, I think, is definitely affected by that because, I mean, his father's definitely wealthy, so I don't think he's like a victim in that sense.
Sure.
But also, like, they did have to leave their home. And then the central other, probably big thing that everybody knows about Alexander Pope is that he had Pott's disease, which he contracted when he was 12, which all these sources say means tuberculosis of the spine. I don't really know what that means because I'm an English person, not a medical person, but it left him crippled, in chronic pain, and he never grew past 4'6", I think.
Really?
And he also, I find this interesting, he did wear like a back brace, which was sort of like a corset, and I think some of his enemies, because yes, he did have enemies, used that against him because they were not above making some fun of somebody's disability.
Oh, of course. It's like they used to think people that were deformed had some sort of a spiritual deformity as well.
Right.
He had like a hunchback, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what those things kind of added up to. I remember reading some accounts of people coming to see Alexander Pope being full of pity for him. You know, here's this person, they have physical difficulties, they're deformed, whatever. And then after spending an evening talking with him, they start wishing they were him.
Yeah. He's definitely like, it's this whiplash effect because he has this really biting wit, and his words are described as like lashes because he could really go after his critics. Like when he wrote the Dunciad, it's full of some pretty mean stuff. Like, he could be a genuinely biting critic. So I think he was a very intimidating enemy in that sense. Also, he did have a disability. And there wasn't sort of medical interventions that I would think of today. I mean, he needed assistance with sort of daily tasks, but he must have been in chronic pain. I am just curious, like, at the human level, what that must have been like.
Right.
And again, he wasn't able to go to university because his family was Catholic, and he himself was also, I mean, he was definitely interested intellectually in Protestantism, but he never converted to Protestantism. He was always Catholic, but he did study extensively at home. His father had money. He was very well read and pretty famous from a young age. Like, in his teenage years, he published the pastorals, which are extremely accomplished poems for someone to be writing as a teenager. And then his big breakout comes, I would say, with The Rape of the Lock, but you could argue that point. And he wrote The Rape of the Lock in 1712, And then a revised edition came out in 1714, and by then he was officially famous. And his financial success was unprecedented. You were talking about...
As like a poet, you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
For any author, until Charles Dickens. Because Charles Dickens was made more money than anybody ever. But he translated the Iliad. No author up to that point had made that amount of money ever. And he was independently wealthy just from writing. He moved his whole
dream.
Yeah, he moved his whole family to this estate in Twickenham. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. I don't know how to pronounce these cutesy English village names. But he moved to Twickenham, and most of the house is gone. Like, it's been torn down because it's 300 years old. But apparently the grotto, he was very proud of this grotto that he had constructed. And he wanted it to feel very mythological. And that still technically exists. So you could go tour that if you wanted to.
Okay, that's on my new list of places to be traveled to.
Yeah.
So yeah, like you were saying, he was independently wealthy. He was kind of a proto-Kickstarter poet in that he was able to get patrons to fund his translation endeavors for the Iliad and the Odyssey before he actually had produced it. He serially would release parts of those translations to his donors. The Iliad was very well received. There were critics at his time that said it was just as good a poem as like the Iliad, basically. What they were saying is that this translation exceeds being a translation.
Right. It is literature in its own right. Yeah.
Which is the highest praise you can give to translation.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like that esteem has kept up as the years have gone by. But yeah, at the time, people really loved it. And then, yeah, he got lazy with the translation of the Odyssey, outsourcing it a lot to interns basically. Then being like, okay, I'll check off that couplet. No, that couplet needs some editing.
Pope.
So Odyssey took much less time.
Yeah.
And was much less good.
He's spending too much time in his grotto, having too much fun in his estate, I guess.
Yeah, I guess.
But it does speak to his ability. Like, he is fluent in Latin and ancient Greek, and he was very... Despite his lack of a formal education, he was very well read and very intelligent and very well versed in all these ancient languages. And I don't know that they're, like, at least in 2024, as of this recording, in America, there's not really the equivalent of that. Like, someone being that independently wealthy and just being that well educated on their own without, like, a formal academic support system.
Sure.
I'm sure it's possible, but I've never known anyone that.
Thank goodness it's a lot easier for people to go to university now.
That's true.
They can go even if they're Catholic.
Even if they're Catholic. And even if they have a disability.
Gosh. I'm glad we live in 2024. Wrote an essay on criticism in his early 20s too, which I feel like had some sort of an impact.
Oh no, it definitely did.
It's one of the poems that most struck me as I was in university, just because there are a lot of lines with really impactful mimesis.
Do you want to define that?
Yeah, so mimesis is where the rhythm of the words will imitate the content of the words. So I wish I had a line or two of it, but in it he talks about snakes slithering slowly, and he's got really long lines in that bit where he breaks out of the pentameter. He has actions of the Iliad imitated, like Ajax throwing a giant stone, and you can really You can feel it because there's more accented syllables than usual in the pentameter line.
So just really very careful, thoughtful poet, the likes of which I don't know that we have today.
I don't know. Yeah. There are some that argue that mimesis doesn't really exist, and I don't know.
Those people are wrong.
I mean, I've definitely felt the effects of mimesis in Pope's work and in other people's work. Like, okay, I do want to talk about his art, because he was born in a time where basically everyone was writing the same form. Like, a lot of people were writing in these closed heroic couplets.
Inspired by classical poetic forms, right?
Yeah. So...
And when we say classical, it just means like from ancient Greek and Latin, you know? So they would read those sources and be really inspired by how Horace or Catullus wrote and try to mimic that in English, which wasn't a perfect translation because Latin and English are obviously very different languages, but they were very inspired by them in the Augustan period. And that kind of, as I understand it, that adoration sort of disappeared during the Romantic period because Wordsworth had very different goals as a poet.
Right.
And he sort of led this new Romantic movement. But in Pope's time, the heroic couplet form was the most elevated form of poetry.
Yeah. So I've got some quotes from the essay on criticism, some of which I think illustrate what we're talking about here. Let's see. Those rules of old, discovered, not devised, are nature still, but nature methodized. Nature, like liberty, is but restrained by the same laws which first herself ordained. So there's this belief that there's like a specific, I don't know, natural way to do poetry. And the ancients just discovered it first. Discovered, not devised, you know. And I guess I can see what they're talking about. Like, with meter, with, like, every language has its own, like, texture, you know? And so learning how to manipulate it kind of is more of a discovery.
Right.
You know? Not just, like...
Like, no one poet is coming up with vowel sounds in English. They're not making the whole system of how a language works, but just kind of using the language as it exists. Pope was the master of that. It's really hard to describe. So, as a contemporary poet, I don't use a lot of end rhyme, meaning I don't do a lot of heroic couplets.
Fair.
Which I think sometimes surprises people who don't read a lot of poetry. They're like, I thought it always had to rhyme at the end. It's like, no, most modern poetry, at least in English, doesn't.
In fact, there are a lot of people who turn their noses up at rhyme.
Right. They feel like it's too contrived.
A decade ago, I did.
Right. And I feel like Alexander Pope, his legacy kind of suffered from that during the 1800s and early 1900s, because his rhymes are so comparatively rigid, meaning like he has in his heroic couplets, like he's got a rhyme at the end of pretty much every line. But that doesn't do justice to the amount of variation that he has, and
Definitely
also
not.
How clever his rhymes are. Like, they don't feel forced to me. They always feel like the rhyme is earned, in the sense that the two words that are rhyming have a very clear relationship to each other, both in sound, because they're rhyming, but also intellectually. Like, I'm like, oh, I see how those two ideas are connected.
Yeah. And what's fascinating about writing in closed heroic couplets is that those two lines are, like, insulated.
Yeah.
It's the idea in it is not going to be derived from what was before. It's not going to bleed into what comes after.
Right.
I mean, it's still related to the other parts of the poem, but it still has its own distinct unit.
Right.
And what's amazing about these encapsulated units and these rhymes is that Pope is able to leverage those along with his own wit and logic to make something not only sound logically true, but feel true.
Yeah.
Because, you know, he brings rhyme and reason together.
And I think that the tragedy of sort of his lost legacy, at least during the 1800s and early 1900s, is, I mean, because he elevated that art form, meaning the heroic couplet, to such an extent more than anyone before or since, when people don't value that art form anymore, then they're not going to value what he accomplished.
Sure.
But then you have scholars in the 1900s who sort of resurrect his legacy. This guy was doing something really cool, and we need to give more credit for what he was doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I found another quote that kind of goes along with his reverence for the ancients, I guess. Learn hence for ancient rules a just esteem. To copy nature is to copy them. Like, wow.
Yeah.
That's a huge statement. Because
he's like Horace figured it all out.
Right. Like, when I think of Wordsworth and the Romantics, it's like, I would 100% rather be out in the park among the trees than read a book.
Right.
You know, that's like 100% Wordsworth's vibe.
Right. He's like, truth comes from nature, not from like looking at dusty books from the past.
Yeah.
And Alexander Pope was like, I like those dusty books from the past. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, he's saying they are nature.
Yeah.
You know, like, which is a huge statement.
I don't think I realize how much I'm influenced by the Romantics until I read someone like Alexander Pope.
Sure.
And he feels so different from what I think poetry should be, again, because his structure does feel comparatively rigid. But then I'm like, oh, there's something kind of nice about this structure. It's interesting.
Yeah, I believe I'm like definitely in Wordsworth's school of philosophy more. Like,
yeah.
I definitely don't feel like Horace is nature, you know? And I do feel like people can get inspiration just from, you know, living life. Like,
right.
It doesn't need to derive from a specific source.
Right.
But boy, do I love what Pope has done with his inspiration and
right.
his structures he's made.
Can I talk about his personal life a little bit?
Ooh, yes. Let's get the teacups out.
It's hard to say, okay, because, like, he wrote a lot of letters, which makes it easy to infer a lot of stuff about his personal life, but I obviously wasn't there, so I don't know. I have seen, like, on the internet, this painting floating around of Alexander Pope getting rejected by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. That is probably based on fact, but it's hard to confirm for sure. But the painting does have a seed of truth in it. So Pope never married. He was... I feel like it's very demeaning to say, like, oh, as a man with a disability, he wouldn't have been able to get married. Because lots of people with disabilities get married.
Sure.
But also,
It's probably because he was insufferable. Is that what you're saying?
No. Well, maybe a little bit. But, like, I'm sure that did affect his romantic life a little. You know, he was by nature, like, he couldn't be up at the... What... I want to say up at the clubs, but they didn't really have those. Up at the salon, you know. He couldn't be gallivanting around to Paris because he had certain physical needs. But he did have lifelong female friends, one of whom was Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. But their friendship terminated very awkwardly. They did send a few letters back and forth, and it's important to note she was married. And we should do a whole episode on Lady Mary Wortley Montagu because she is very iconic in her own right.
Ooh, okay.
And she did like to make fun of a lot of male poets of the day. And initially, she and Pope were sending letters back and forth because she was the wife of an ambassador to Turkey. So she was in the East, and they were sending these letters back and forth. And Pope's letters, I think, are very flirtatious. Hers kind of are, but I don't think she was as into him as he was into her. And again, she was married. Also, this has nothing to do with anything, but I just think it's really funny. So she eloped And again, I apologize for this tangent, but I have to say it.
Oh no, please.
So Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, she eloped. Her family wanted her to get married to this other guy, but instead she got married to this ambassador to the Middle East. Or to Turkey, I should say. But the guy that her parents wanted her to marry, guess what his name was? It's such an iconic name.
Wait, so this is like a famous person?
No, it's just a really weird name.
Oh, I don't know. What's the name?
Clotfield Skeffington. That's for real his name. I swear.
Clotfield Skeffington.
Lord Clotfield Skeffington. And she was like, I don't want to marry Lord Clotfield Skeffington. And her parents were like, well, you're gonna. And she was like, no. So she straight up eloped with this other guy. And she's in Turkey. She's got kids. She's got a husband. And Pope starts writing her kind of these flirtatious letters. And then she comes back to England for a brief period. And I don't know what Pope thought was going to happen, but apparently they had some kind of encounter. And the rumor is that he proposed marriage. And I don't know, again, where he thought that would go, because she was married. But anyway, whatever happened, and I wasn't there, so I don't know. But the relationship soured very quickly. And by the time of his writing the Dunciad, he was insulting her pretty much in every publication that he wrote. He called her like a whore and all kinds of stuff, which to me smacks of sour grapes, just because it's such an abrupt transition from sort of the vaguely flirtatious letters he was sending her to, again, how he's talking about her in the Dunciad, which is very insulting.
Yeah, as amazing as Pope is, I've definitely read some of his poetry that has suggested a lesser developed understanding of women, like verging on sexism.
It's complicated though, because his take on women in The Rape of the Lock I love. Like his ability to sort of be this male voyeur in a female space, I think is really, really cool and interesting and much more elevated and mature than a lot of like Jonathan Swift's poetry and stuff. But at the same time, like you're saying, like some of his criticisms of women were outright nasty. Yeah. He also had this lifelong friendship with Martha Blount, and I have no idea if they had a sexual relationship or not. He did leave her 1,000 pounds in his will. And she was over at his house at various points.
Okay, I feel like we've talked about a few things that can segue pretty naturally into some poems we want to read.
Right.
I'll go ahead and start if that's okay. Mm-hmm. So the poem I'm looking at is an epistle to Martha Blount. This poem that he wrote is in his iconic style of, closed heroic couplets. But I will say it's more emotional than we usually get from Pope. He's usually really caustically arguing something in a really entertaining, satirical way. But here, it seems he's using another mode of address, which I find fascinating. So I'll go ahead and read that. Epistle to Miss Blount on her leaving the town after the coronation. On some fond virgin, whom her mother's care drags from the town to wholesome country air, just when she learns to roll a melting eye and hear a spark, yet think no danger nigh. From the dear man unwillingly she must sever, yet takes one kiss before she parts forever. Thus from the world fair Zephelinda flew, saw others happy, and with sighs withdrew. Not that their pleasures caused her discontent. She sighed not that they stayed, but that she went. She went to plain work and to purling brooks, old-fashioned halls, dull ants, and croaking rooks. She went from opera, park, assembly, play, to morning walks and prayers 3 hours a day, to pass her time twixt reading and bohea, to muse and spill her solitary tea. Or cold coffee, trifle with the spoon, count the slow clock, and dine exact at noon, divert her eyes with pictures in the fire, hum half a tune, tell stories to the squire, up to her godly garret after 7, there starve and pray, for that's the way to heaven. Some squire perhaps you take a delight to rack, whose game is whisk, whose treat a toast in sack. I don't get all these terms, but apparently it's like flirtatious or games or something. Who visits with a gun, presents you birds, then gives a smacking buss and cries, "No words!" Or with his hound comes hollowing from the stable, makes loves with nods and knees beneath a table. Whose laughs are hearty, though his jests are coarse, and loves you best of all things, but his horse. In some fair evening, on your elbow laid, your dream of triumphs in the rural shade, in pensive thought recall the fancied scene, see coronations rise on every green. Before you pass the imaginary sights of lords and earls and dukes and gartered knights, while the spread fan or shades your closing eyes, then give one flirt, and all the vision flies. Thus vanish scepters, coronets, and balls, and leave you in lone woods or empty walls. So when your slave, at some dear idle time, not plagued with headaches or the want of rhyme, stands in the streets abstracted from the crew, and while he seems to study, thinks of you. Just when his fancy points your sprightly eyes, or sees the blush of soft Parthenia rise, gay pats my shoulder, and you vanish quite. Streets, chairs, and coxcombs rush upon my sight. Vexed to be still in town, I knit my brow, look sour and hum a tune, as you may now.
Gay was the name of his friend, right?
I believe so.
Yeah. He wrote The Beggar's Opera.
Oh, okay.
I think that's the same guy.
So, I mean, here we still have, like, plenty of satire. We have a lot of humor, which I think is meant to entertain his addressee, you know, these visions of how boring it must be where she is. Mm-hmm. But I feel like we get a moment of, like, vulnerability here. You know, her so-called slave or whatever that
Again,
can
he's
only
calling
think
himself.
of her.
Yeah. I think that's so sexy. Like, he's saying, I'm your slave. But he is very vulnerable, sort of at the end, but it feels really earned. It doesn't feel sentimental or maudlin, because he's got so much humor up above. He's
Right.
making fun of these country squires and, like, just the, I don't know, this religious performance.
Right. And he's, like, critiquing religion and country life, and yeah. And then I love how he goes from the third person, you know, talking about your slave, to, like, admitting that it's him.
Yeah.
I knit my brow. Yeah.
Very well done.
A lot of Pope's poems are long, and I feel like they're sustained because they're very thoughtful and full of tiny units of logical, rhyming loveliness.
Right.
But this is a neat example of a shorter poem of his, satirical and vulnerable at the same time. So, yeah, that's why I wanted to show that one.
I really like that one. But again, it kind of, to me, even makes it more ambiguous what their relationship was. Because he uses some terms that to me seem pretty romantic. And he's like teasing her about her romantic life.
Right.
But maybe they're just friends. I don't know.
I should look at Raven Block now, yeah?
Yeah, and I want to preface this by saying I think the title throws a lot of people off.
Oh, absolutely.
I know it did me when I was younger. I was like, what are we reading? The Rape of the what? It's meant to be this, I know it sounds bizarre, but it's meant to be a humorous mock epic poem. So rape is obviously, it's a hyperbole. So he's talking about an actual feud that did exist between these two families, which he was called in to mediate, actually. So a young man cut off a lock of hair from a young woman belonging to another family, and these are both very wealthy families. So it was a big deal that, I guess because cutting off a lock of hair was seen as a very romantic gesture. So like him, so at one part it's sort of much ado about nothing. Like he just cut a tiny little piece of her hair. It's not a big deal at all. But then it was blown up by these two families into this whole scandal because there's so many like sexual and romantic connotation around his doing that. And so Pope, to make, as sort of this mediator for these families, he's called upon by his friend Carol, who gets referenced in the poem. His friend Carol is like, can you write like a funny poem to like sort of bring these two families together to mediate this conflict? And Pope turns it into this very thoughtful, I think very funny sort of undermining of the elites in London, which I find very funny, by showing, again, through exaggeration, like how ridiculous this whole scandal is, because it's not a rape. He just cut off a tiny little piece of her hair, but he just exaggerates this whole thing and makes it seem like this big epic conflict, and he structures it like it's this epic. He's got a lot of like heroic couplets throughout. He makes it almost feel a little bit like the Iliad, like he's talking about the Trojan War.
Right.
But it's just, again, this silly little incident that gets blown up way out of proportion. But I feel like the title does throw some people off. But it's deliberately meant to be hyperbolic and exaggerated and funny and weird.
Right. And I think rape back then didn't always mean sexual assault, too.
Right.
I think
that's true.
It was like stealing something or whatever. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's hyperbolic all the way through in such delightful ways. Ooh, I'm so excited.
I have to address something. So in the intro, he's addressing, so the real woman whose hair was cut, Arabella Fermor, he dedicates this to her, and he's like, it's not about you, but it's totally about her. And he mentions the Rosicrucians. I don't know a lot about them because they were a secret society that supposedly originated in like the 1300s in Germany, and Pope was very fascinated with them. The Rosicrucians, the society does still exist. There are different chapters in different major cities. There's actually a chapter in New Orleans. But they're tied up with the Freemasons. They're also tied up with Knights of the Templar and a lot of different secret societies and different sort of ancient doctrines. So he does mention that secret society in the intro. And he means it because he's referring to this specific novel in which it's talking about how there are like these spiritual beings all around us all the time. So he's referring specifically to that idea. But it also is interesting, and if anyone wants to go down a Wikipedia wormhole, I think the Rosicrucians are very interesting.
Okay, so you're saying the Rosicrucians are kind of an allusion to like the airy spirits that attend in the Rape of the Lock.
Right.
I love how he included them. He included them in the revision, is what I understand, which just really like makes the mock epic just more of that actual genre, the epic,
right.
the greater powers.
So instead of like in the Trojan War, you've got these Greek gods interfering on behalf of mortals, and instead of that, in this mock epic, he's talking about these spirits, these sylphs, he calls them, interfering on behalf of this wronged girl. It's very funny. So I'm going to start at the beginning, and I'm going to skip a lot, obviously, and just jump around a little bit, and I apologize for that. But it is 5 cantos, which is quite long.
You all should just go read it.
Just go read it. Go read it. But he starts off strong. He's like, what dire offense from amorous causes springs? What mighty contests rise from trivial things? I sing this verse to Carol, that's his friend. Muse is due. This even Belinda may vouchsafe to view. So Belinda is kind of the code name he's giving to Arabella, whose hair was cut. Slight is the subject, but not so the praise, if she inspire and he approve my lays. Saying, what strange motive, goddess, could compel a well-bred lord to assault a gentle belle? So already there's so much hyperbole, like it was not an assault. He cut off a tiny lock of her hair. But again, the exaggeration kind of makes it funny. A well-bred lord to assault a gentle belle, of say what stranger cause yet unexplored, could make a gentle belle reject a lord. In tasks so bold can little men engage, and soft bosoms dwell such mighty rays? It's so funny. And then my favorite part, after he describes all these spirits that are kind of hovering around all the characters in this scandal, he then describes Belinda, who's the code name for Arabella, whose hair got cut. He describes her getting up, And it's just, I just love this because it's sort of this male voyeur describing this woman getting ready. And he's definitely making fun of her. He's making fun of her 100% and her vanity. Mm-hmm. But he's also just describing her morning, how do you say it, toilette, like her process of getting ready, with such detail that it's almost respectful. But again, it's complicated because he's making fun of her. But there's so much attention to detail that I feel like a lot of men wouldn't take the time to write out anyway. So he says, when Shock, the dog, thought Belinda slept too long, leapt up and waked his mistress with his tongue. 'Twas then, Belinda, of report say true, thy eyes first opened on a billet doux. Wounds, charms, and ardors were no sooner read, but all the vision vanished from thy head, and now unveiled the toilette stands displayed, each silver vase in mystic order laid. First robed in white, the nymph intent adores, with head uncovered the cosmetic powers. A heavenly image in the glass appears, to that she bends, to that her eye she rears. The inferior priestess at her altar's side, trembling, begins the sacred rites of pride. Unnumbered treasures ope at once, and here the various offerings of the world appear. From each she nicely culls with curious toil, and decks the goddess with the glittering spoil. This casket India's glowing gems unlock, and all Arabia breathes from yonder box. The tortoise here and elephant unite, transformed to combs, the speckled and the white. Here files of pins extend their shining rows, puffs, powders, patches, Bibles, billet doux. Now awful beauty puts on all its arms. The fair each moment rises in her charms, prepares her smiles, awakens every grace, and calls forth all the wonders of her face. Sees by degrees a purer blush arise, and keener lightnings quicken in her eyes. The busy sylphs surround their darling care. These set the head, and those divide the hair. Some fold the sleeve, while others plait the gown, and Betty's praised for labors not her own. So again, it's just this very careful, again, definitely undermining, witty attack on her vanity.
Just this composed grandiloquence.
Yeah,
it's just
yeah.
amazing.
But also the attention to detail, like he seems
right.
genuinely infatuated with her. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
I find that so interesting. Because Jonathan Swift, he writes a lot about women, their vanity and getting ready, but he doesn't so in a very caustic way, like making fun of how stupid women are and how vain women are.
We should mention for just 2 seconds that Jonathan Swift, the writer of A Modest Proposal, mm-hmm. of Gulliver's Travels, mm-hmm. He was friends with Alexander Pope. Yeah. They were writing buddies.
And Lady Mary Wortley Montagu did not like him either. Last little bit that I'll read. So this is when the Baron is the guy that, the code name for the guy that cuts off the lock of her hair. Says, thus far both armies to Belinda yield. And again, armies is supposedly referring to this army of spirits who surround the characters.
Okay, so this isn't when they're playing the card game.
This is there's a long description when they're playing the card game, and again, everything is exaggerated and made to seem like this whole battle is happening. But there's this part. This just behind Belinda's neck he spread, as o'er the fragrant steams she bends her head. Swift to the lock 1,000 sprites repair, 1,000 wings by turn blow back the hair, and thrice they twitched the diamond at her ear. Thrice she looked back, and thrice the foe drew near. Just in that instant anxious Ariel sought the close recesses of the virgin's thought. As on the nosegay in her breast reclined, he watched the ideas rising in her mind. Suddenly he viewed, in spite of all her art, an earthly lover lurking at her heart. Amazed, confused, he found his power expired, resigned to fate, and with a sigh retired. The pier now spreads the glittering forefects wide. That means the scissors. To enclose the lock, now joins it to divide. E'en then before the fatal engine closed, a wretched sylph too fondly interposed. Fate urged the shears and cut the sylph in twain. The airy substance soon unites again. So it's the scissors closing around this little spirit, and it cuts the spirit in half as he tries to defend this little curl of hair.
Yeah, there's 5 lines leading up to that thing getting cut. Harold Bloom is convinced that is an allusion to Paradise Lost, mm-hmm. and someone dying in that. I can't remember.
Probably.
But then, the last line undermines it that you just read, but airy substance soon unites again.
The meeting points the sacred hair dissever from the fair head forever and forever. Then flashed the living lightning from her eyes, and screams of horror rend the affrighted skies. And it just goes on. It's this whole exaggerated battle between the Baron and Belinda. And again, those are code names for the people that were actually involved in this. But again, it's like much.
Okay, can I put you on the spot to find some lines that I love?
Yeah.
There's the one where like it exemplifies the phrase "if looks could kill." Right, like the maidens like look and the men die. But then they're so happy that they resurrect or whatever.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it, though.
That's okay.
But yeah, you guys should just go read it. It's very
just go
clever.
read it.
I just find so interesting because Alexander Pope, again, he could be so caustic and vicious when he was criticizing women that he didn't like. But he also seems so genuinely infatuated with women in like a really beautiful way, like describing, at the same time, her vanity, her use of religion and piety is just performative, and how self-centered she is, and he's attacking all of that. But also he seems, again, genuinely infatuated with this idea of her in a really beautiful way, just kind of celebrating just how beautiful she is. And I think that tension is so interesting, and I feel like a lot of, again, I'm comparing it with Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift did not demonstrate, I don't think, that level of sensitivity. And I could be wrong. I'd be happy to be wrong if someone could point me to one of his poems where he does.
I just wish that these two poets could have read Wollstonecraft's thoughts of femininity. Do you know Wollstonecraft?
Yeah.
And like how just the whole idea that if you're going to restrain women's resources, you're going to get
very
coquettish
vain.
women.
Yeah.
Like they're gonna do what they need to get by. Like, I wish they could have seen that or read about that, but oh well.
They're attacking them for vanity that they help perpetuate.
Right.
But, I mean, Pope, the way that he just kind of admits the Belinda and Arabella, who Belinda was the code name for, that she is the most beautiful woman in London. And just kind of, the poem in a weird way is 5 cantos of him just saying, she's a gorgeous woman. And just, I don't know. I always like it. This is a very strange tangent. When you can see in a poet just an earnest celebration of beauty. Even physical beauty, which may seem superficial, but just elevating it to the point where it feels like art, you know?
Yeah.
And even at the same time that he's totally making fun of this whole situation and this woman and this whole conflict that's just been blown out of proportion, he transforms this very silly subject matter into, I think, a very kind of weird, earnest meditation on, like, female beauty. Which I think is so interesting.
That is interesting. Okay, so I think we've got to wrap it up.
Okay.
So yeah, little writing prompt for you all. I invite you to maybe not even poetry. I just invite you to write a letter to someone that's important to you.
Yeah.
That you have not written to in a while. Someone who's moved away, perhaps. Doesn't have to be a lover. Hopefully it's not some other married person. But just, write a letter in which you try to make the other person laugh. All right. Stay immersed yourselves in the whims of verse. Do not fall heretic to the wiles of your prosaic lives.